let me let that get started. And, and then I'll share my screen with you just a minute. I've got some, we've got some talking points. We agree on some of them, and some of them we may be on the fly, but it's okay. It's going to work out fine.
Yeah, today we're going to explore the popular diets like the Mediterranean Mind, the MIND diet, and the ketogenic. And then we're going to show you why ketosis, especially through a carnivore diet, stands out as a powerful tool for PD. And wanted to also today wanted to unpack modern food, the differences between modern food and the differences between food from prior to 1920. Food has drastically changed in the last 100 years. And I found this interesting little fact that I found online. Uh, apples, apples and vegetables and fruits have radically changed in the last 100 years. So the apple or
Yes.
the strawberry or the broccoli or the kale that you're eating today would look and taste and be vastly different, even on a genetic level, from even those same foods 100 years ago. So there's quite a lot to unpack here because
Yeah.
food, I think the key concept is the food that we think we're eating that's healthy is often not really the food that we're eating that is healthy. And one of the, I would say, as a carnivore practitioner and proponent, one of the major points that I get pushback from people when it comes to vegetables. They say, well, what do you mean vegetables aren't healthy for me? So we're going to kind of explore the differences in modern vegetables and vegetables from 100 years ago today, and try to provide some insight for the listeners on those differences. And I know Michael is a recent convert to carnivore diet, but were you eating a lot of vegetables prior to that?
Yeah, I mean, not more than I would say typical, because I'm definitely not vegan or vegetarian, but I would say admittedly that a lot of the meals that I had revolved around that mindset of, okay, every meal has vegetables and a protein and you know, maybe a
Yeah.
fruit or a starch or whatever. So more of a traditional model. But I would say by and large, I was already eating a little bit more low carb than some people.
Yeah.
Um, and the thing is about apples that you mentioned that piqued my attention, is that I was listening to a podcast several months ago, and we are going to talk up. I wanted to talk about insulin resistance as well in the beginning of this a little bit because
That's a
that's a
major,
really,
really important part. I read
yeah,
somewhere 50 to 60% of people diagnosed with Parkinson's disease also have some level of
yeah,
insulin resistance.
it's a really important thing to consider with Parkinson's and a lot of other chronic health conditions. And so anyway, I want to go into that, but what brought to mind when you said apples was Benjamin, is it Benjamin Bickman? I think that's his name. Dr. Bickman, who's a professor and researcher in Canada, Alberta, I believe. He was talking about how apples now, compared to 100 years ago, apples now are full of sugar and they're
Yeah.
genetically modified to be full of sugar.
Yeah.
So they are not, they're probably, I mean, like, I don't know how much percentage difference, but like the flavor would be totally different 100 years ago. Amount of sugar would have been less as a natural, completely natural apple out in a field somewhere, apple tree. Um, Same with other fruits.
Yeah. And I saw another thing on watermelons. They add chromosomes to watermelons so that they're 30 to 50% bigger than they used to grow naturally. So they've basically turned natural fruits and vegetables into a hybrid of kind of candied apples.
Yeah.
And they've
Sugar
done that.
bombs.
Yeah, sugar bombs. They've done that through genetic modifications. And
Hmm.
so I think, we used to hear there's so much dogma in nutrition. Like
Oh, yeah.
we grew up hearing things like 3 meals a day. You get 3 meals a day to keep you healthy, or an apple a day keeps the doctor away.
Right.
And if you actually go through some of the dogma in nutrition, it's really everywhere, right? Eat your vegetables, It's kind of a never ending track. And the lowest common denominator is on it. If you kind of get into the weeds of nutritional dogma, what I've found is they're kind of always warding you off of protein. They're kind of trying to make you scared of protein. And then even in the
Yeah.
proteins, they're trying to make you extra scared of the highest nutrient dense protein in favor of less optimal proteins like chickens, right? So you
Yep.
start to see a lowest common denominator through the literature and the ads and stuff. And really, at the end of the day, they're just selling sugar. They're
Yeah,
just selling
exactly.
sugar.
And that's the problem that we need to talk about. And we'll seg into that in just a moment. But also, was going to say, with proteins, with a couple things. So, what you're talking about, vegetables and fruits, first of all, in addition to what we're talking about with genetic modification, you also have to be aware of the pesticides being used, which are a huge problem with Parkinson's disease. And if you were around for my interview with Dr. Michael Oken this morning, we talked a lot about that. And how it's not exactly like new news, but it's coming out more and more how much we're exposed to toxins that we just aren't thinking about or aware of. And you know, anyway, that they have a new book out called The Parkinson's Plan that includes a lot of that information. But
Yeah, and
um,
it becomes plainly obvious. I was actually at one of my Parkinson's clients' houses this morning, and he lives on a vineyard, and they were spraying the vineyard.
yep,
So they're going through and they're spraying some sort of a pesticide or herbicide on to the leaves of the vines to keep,
bugs down. Hmm.
insects and bugs off of them to increase their yield. It's all about yield increase, right?
Yep,
And I think that term yield increase that comes before human health in 99% of agricultural operations today. And people are going to say, well, what about organic, right? Well, we can eat organic fruits and vegetables, but then this is coming from an agricultural kid who grew up on a farm. I grew up right beside an organic farm, and it was an organic vegetable farm. And, it's right next door to my dad's farm, and he had corn, and he's fertilizing and he's putting glyphosates onto his crops.
oh,
It's only
glyphosate, yeah.
it's only a few feet away from the organic farm, and how much goes into the air, and how much, it's pretty hard to get clean fruits and vegetables in the year 2025. And most fruits and vegetables have a fairly thin membrane. The other thing to remember with fruits and vegetables is the thicker the membrane, the less toxins it's going to accumulate inside of it. But
Hmm.
things like grapes and kiwis and
Very thin skin.
thin
Yeah.
skinned, it's going to be loaded. It's going to be loaded with toxins. And in the standard person who has Parkinson's disease, it's an important factor to remember that your system has already been compromised by modern toxins.
Yep.
It's already been compromised. And so the first step, the first strategic step would be to think about, how do I accumulate no more toxins, right?
Right. Yeah, that's all important to really consider all of those things. And again, things like that can lead to Parkinson's diagnosis in the future. For some folks, some of those exposures may have been the cause. And then moving forward, trying to reduce your Parkinson's symptoms to heal as much as possible from that chronic illness. These are things to avoid in the future as well. So, and again, I wanted to talk about insulin resistance briefly, but throughout the presentation, we're going to try to stick to bullet points of, well, among other things, but we're not arbitrarily saying this is all we're going to talk about, but we're going to talk about dietary management of Parkinson's, or kind of the focus of food as medicine. Basically, those go together. But other habits too, not just food. Diets that reduce inflammation, as well as those that can encourage cellular autophagy, which is a key factor.
Yeah. Well, it takes us right back to the insulin resistance. So in the modern people, in the year 2025, if you're 50 years old, you're probably at a point in history where you've accumulated more sugar, carbohydrates into your system in comparison to any other point in the last 1 or 2 million years of human evolution. So
Right.
so our bodies haven't adapted to the foods that we're eating today, and this is leading to insulin resistance in the majority of the population today, and that's a key contributor to the symptoms in Parkinson's disease.
Right. And I wanted to talk about that too in terms of the, just as a review of kind of the causative factors of Parkinson's at the cellular level, um, regardless of cause, but regardless of trigger or cause, as I mentioned here, the common link, or one of the common links that we can find most often, is sick mitochondria in the cells that produce dopamine. Those are with the PD Generation Project and other, they found these links to mutations of certain genes that will affect the mitochondrial health in the cell, as well as things like protein aggregation, which I mentioned alpha-synuclein here. That's an abnormal, it's a normal protein, but it abnormally collects or aggregates partly because of those mitochondrial changes and damage to the mitochondria. And that releases damaged mitochondria release reactive oxygen species, which causes more inflammation and can lead to cell death. And the alpha-synuclein actually causes dopamine to get trapped in those nerve cells and not be released properly. So that as well can cause toxicity within the cells and cell death. So that's disease process speaking. But what we're going to be talking about, both with insulin resistance and with the dietary approaches, is trying to improve these negative processes.
So, but that's okay. So we get that, but then if you go online, you're going to hear that the highest recommended diet for Parkinson's disease is the Mediterranean diet.
Yeah, exactly. And we're going to talk about why that could be problematic in a little bit. And I agree with that. To pause on that, because mind and Mediterranean are similar, and there's some less than ideal things about that.
Well,
I would say Mediterranean diet's going to be better than the standard American diet,
yes.
but there's some shortcomings too.
And then for most of the people in the US, they have to remember they're not
Yeah.
in the Mediterranean. They're in the good
Well,
old
yeah.
US of A.
Yeah.
And if you took
Food
flour,
quality matters.
wheat is very different in Europe compared to the US,
Oh, yeah.
as is pretty much everything. So, but I
True.
see your slide here. I'll read it out for you because I've heard you say that before, and I can't really stress. It's a great quote. Parkinson's disease is really a metabolic disorder disguised as a brain disease. That's a Michael Hyland quote, and it is,
For what it's worth.
it's a first principle. It's super important. If you have PD, you really, really need to understand that quote from Michael. Why don't you tell us more about it?
Well, essentially, it goes into what we're about to discuss with insulin resistance, as well as kind of what we hinted at earlier. Mitochondria, if you're looking at the function of mitochondria as an organelle of a cell, one of the principles of mitochondria is that they produce cellular energy. So they produce the ATP that we all need for every process our body uses. I mean, lifting your pinky finger requires ATP. Your brain takes up to 20% of the energy that you use, even though it weighs like tenths of a percent of what your whole body weighs. And so what I mean by that is that Parkinson's is a whole body disease. It's not just a brain disease. And mitochondria affect cell metabolism, and the things that we eat and the habits that we have affect cellular metabolism. And those things can improve Parkinson's disease if you already have the condition. Or I should say modifying those things, making changes, positive changes.
So changes to the stand. So okay, so I get this point. I've talked about this point in lots of different nutritional groups online and podcasts, and I always like to add in a little point to it.
Hmm.
Every
Please.
just every individual, if you're listening to this, if you just think back, if you're 40, 50, 60 years old, just think back on your nutritional landscape over your lifetime. And when you were born, so it starts at birth, right? You were born and you were born in ketosis. And following that, you either went on to breast milk or formula. And following that, your first birthday came around and they probably fed you chocolate cake to get the pictures of chocolate all over the 1 year old's face. And following that, most of us were generally manipulated by sugar as children while we were raised. And that happens in schools, that happens at birthdays, that happens at all holidays. So if you take Valentine's Day and Christmas and birthdays and Easter, and if you take all of those things, and if you just spend a few minutes thinking back on your own nutritional journey, and you can just imagine the frequency of food ingredients, chemical food ingredients, and carbohydrates that have impacted your health over the long term. I find that's a really important thing to do with people, is just to understand the full scope of carbohydrates that's been inflicted upon you in this last 100 years. And it took a lot of technology to get us here. It took refrigeration technology, and it took
Yeah.
distribution technology like asphalt and global shipping to even make it, to even allow it to happen. Without those components, we never would have been able to eat carbohydrates and sugars, fruits and vegetables at the levels that we do today. So it's no wonder that most people have accumulated some level of insulin resistance and
Right.
chronic inflammation in the year 2025. Because what happens to me frequently is I'll get onto a conversation with people and they'll say to me, well, I'm eating healthy. So they have this idea that they're eating healthy. And maybe they've been eating healthy for the last 5 or 10 years as they've matured and become more aware of their own health. But in reality, if you actually study the foods and the ingredients that they've been eating over the last 10 years, they might be very alarmed to actually learn how unhealthy they've actually been eating in truth.
Absolutely. And in discussing insulin resistance, and I think this is important to go into to relate to Parkinson's, and I think what you said goes perfectly into this topic. Um, so basically, insulin resistance is kind of I'd say an epidemic, if not a pandemic, in the Western world right now. And there's many chronic diseases linked to insulin resistance. Parkinson's is one associated, as Lars quoted a statistic earlier, but also other conditions, polycystic ovarian syndrome, um, and possibly others. So there's multiple things here, and what can lead to insulin resistance is some of the things that Lars was just talking about, which is poor diet is one of the primary causes. Refined, uh, you know, enriched flour, white breads, pasta, a lot of sugar, high fructose corn syrup, trans fats, and seed oils. They spike insulin every time you ingest them. And what's happening is basically the cells become almost what you'd call tolerant of insulin. So they almost don't recognize it anymore because of how often they're bombarded with it. So insulin resistance is not the same as diabetes, but it could lead to diabetes. Insulin resistance, you would almost could refer to it as a pre-diabetic condition. But anyway, physical activity doesn't help either, because inactivity does not help, because when you use your muscles, you're using up glucose as the energy source. And that's how exercise can help insulin resistance and diabetes. But lack of exercise is pretty common, and it reduces sensitivity to insulin and therefore can increase your chances of being resistant to it. Even a little bit of movement every day, it could be nasal breathing while walking in your neighborhood, can help that. So
And then
That's not all.
in the land of total body composition, there's kind of a principle that all the masters follow. You cannot out exercise a bad diet. And
That's true too.
a
Yeah,
little side note. So back to the mitochondrial dysfunction. You're impairing the brain's ability to use glucose for energy because you've
exactly.
accumulated so much of that glucose. Your brain is starting to shut that off. It doesn't want it anymore. It's not recognizing it as a viable energy source. And so what happens is you're eating, but your brain cannot process that energy anymore. So you see this ripple effect in metabolisms, and it just starts at the cell, ripples outward, right out from the cell, right out into your body fat composition on the outside of your body, on your
Hmm.
body's largest organ, the skin, and everything in between. I like some of my, a lot, for example, a lot of the women I work with, they either have osteoporosis or they're right kind of at the limit of having it. So their bone density has been decreased, which is another side effect of over accumulating carbohydrates.
Yep. A couple other additional points about insulin resistance here before we move on is excess body fat, especially visceral fat, which meaning fat around the organs internally. Um, that releases inflammatory cytokines, which we're going to talk about cytokines in a little bit, um, and immunity. But inflammation interferes with insulin signaling because of the excess body fat. Also, chronic inflammation is just kind of ironic because these kind of feed into each other. If you have any kind of a chronic inflammatory condition, that's going to increase insulin reception and resistance in the future, or it could become resistant because of it. But also, insulin resistance causes inflammation. So
Yeah.
it's a vicious cycle. And gut dysbiosis is the condition of having a problem of gut bacteria and absorption issues. And Parkinson's disease, of course, is linked with gut dysbiosis. And neurodegeneration goes along with that as well. So all these things play into each other.
Is there any good news?
The good news is you can do something about it.
The good news is, thankfully,
Oops,
our brain
went
is
too
a
far.
hybrid energy system.
How did I get so far ahead? Sorry.
That's all right. I can chat about the
Oh,
brain's hybrid energy system, but let's go into this slide first on insulin
sorry.
resistance and
This is the
inflammation.
last slide. This is actually the last slide on insulin resistance. Is that poor sleep and sleep apnea conditions like that can cause cortisol release, and cortisol influences blood sugar. Actually, ghrelin is a hormone that affects satiety,
Yeah.
and so ghrelin actually is responsible for partially for hunger. So you might crave more carbohydrates when
Yeah.
you are in sleep deprivation, and cortisol also raises blood sugar. So that can contribute to insulin resistance as well as chronic stress from other causes, as well as sleep can be a stressor, sleep problems, I should say.
Major
But
stressor.
yeah, the high cortisol levels, of course, as I mentioned a second ago, raise blood sugar and block insulin's absorption. So you basically are in a chronic state of fight or flight. Instead of being in a parasympathetic state, resting and digesting, you're in a sympathetic nervous system state.
That's just all of this stuff just makes me think of that deep ripple effect. And that ripple effect, you kind of imagine it like every time you eat carbohydrates, you're kind of increasing that ripple effect into a tidal wave of disharmony into the body
Yeah,
because because we just were not historically designed. We were not evolutionary designed to eat this much carbohydrates because they were never abundant in the land up until about 1 or 200 years ago. So
right.
just I like to keep pointing people back to that. I find that when we get into the details of this diet and nutrition, that sometimes you'll lose people. And
Yeah,
then when I lose people, I just have to continually remind them that in the year 2025, we are eating a completely foreign, a historically foreign way of eating in the year 2025. We were generally designed to be in ketosis for the majority of our lives, which is the
Yeah.
opposite of um, ketosis would be the secondary energy system in the brain. It's a popular word out there, so but I'll let you get to the next slide before we dive into that one.
Yeah, and actually the way I had structured this, and we can change this. I don't know why, but we lost several people that were on the Zoom with. Oh no, they're still here. Or maybe a couple people dropped out and somebody came back just now. Anyway, I kind of gone into different diets that could be anti-inflammatory, but there's a caveat at the end. So I can glaze over those and kind of just hit the highlights, and then we can kind of talk a little bit more about um, all the other stuff. So, what do you think about that? Is it okay if we just kind of
Yeah,
touch on these?
yeah, let's touch on them.
So the short list I have here, it's not really short, but there's keto diet. These are ones you may have heard of, basically. Keto diet, paleo diet, Mediterranean and mind diet, low carbohydrate approaches, the Walls protocol, intermittent fasting, and caloric restriction. Combinations of these may also be done. And I think you'll find that what we're going to talk about near the end is more of a combination of some of these and a completely different approach than most of these. but but these are, I think it's worthwhile to talk about. What,
These are the diets that people are going to hear about,
yeah, these are the
and
diets that,
they're going to
yeah.
experiment. Yeah, I myself, I've done all of these except the Walls protocol.
Yeah, and Wall's protocol is specifically for was developed for MS, as we're going to talk about. Terry Walls is a physician who was diagnosed with MS herself and developed the protocol. It's based off of Mediterranean, but there's some nuances that are a little different. So let's go into keto first. And then this is the keto in quotations. This is what, if you Google keto or keto diet, you're probably going to find some version of this on Google. But essentially, in short, it's high fat, moderate protein, low carbohydrate. That the idea behind it is shifting your metabolism from glucose to ketones for energy. It can help the mitochondria in that sense because ketones are an efficient energy source for mitochondria, can help reduction of oxidative stress, and it's been shown to improve mitochondrial function and increase mitochondrial biogenesis, which is the ability of the cell to create new mitochondria.
Key point there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a key point there. Now we're going to talk more about ketosis, but that's the keto diet, not ketosis. So, paleo, similarly, but this is a little different in the sense that it focuses on specifically whole foods, lean meats, which is a key factor there that's different than what we're going to talk about, fish, vegetables, fruits, nuts, and seeds while avoiding processed foods, grains, legumes, and dairy. The idea behind this is, in terms of mitochondria support, is that since it's rich in antioxidants and omega-3s, it can help mitochondrial function in that sense, and can reduce oxidative stress on the mitochondria. And by eliminating processed foods, in theory, you're also helping to reduce potential inflammatory triggers. But as we talked about at the beginning, there's no guarantee you're getting completely pure whole foods.
I did the paleo diet very thoroughly and effectively for 5 years.
Uh-huh.
And in the land of body composition, it reduced my body fat. I increased my muscle mass with it, but I hit a plateau of inflammation.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was one of the cons. There's a lot of pros with the paleo diet, but there are some cons. One
Mm-hmm.
of the major cons with the paleo diet is you're going to see here on the list. It's got you can eat a lot of different foods on the paleo diet, and
Right.
over time, I found that I couldn't get rid of the deepest layers of inflammation I had while on the paleo diet.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not the best diet for if inflammation is a primary goal you have. the
Yeah,
paleo diet, it can do a lot for your body composition, but it doesn't
sure.
go deep enough to reduce the cellular inflammation.
Yeah, you're going to have more inflammation with things like the fruits, nuts, and seeds,
Yeah.
and your and some vegetables potentially. But yeah, it's just
But then again, it's like on the paleo diet, and I ran into this problem on the paleo diet. You go, it allow, so there's certain foods that are allowed on the paleo diet. And once you get into those foods, like for example, dairy, I don't, did your slide say that? Can you go back to that other slide for a quick second for me?
I think it actually said to recommend eliminating dairy.
Yeah. So that's a good point because when I did it, certain types of dairy were allowed, like cottage cheese, and then
Uh-huh.
certain types weren't. So it became hard to parse apart what was really allowed and what wasn't, because vegetables, there's a lot of different types of vegetables. There's a lot of different types of fruits. There's a lot of different types of nuts and seeds. So basically, you're going to be accumulating a lot of different foods into your body, and that's going to detach you from the inflammation reduction. And that's what I ran into. After you've done it for a while, after you start the paleo diet off pretty much eating chicken and broccoli, and then 5 years later you're pretty much back into the sad diet.
Right. Sad for multiple reasons, but we mean standard American diet.
Yeah.
But so, yeah, exactly. Um, and just quickly, Ganymede7 on YouTube said any news on insecticides as a major cause of PD. Yeah, you want to watch the interview I did with Dr. Oken this morning. Um, but in short, insecticides are a big problem. Glyphosate is one. There's paraquat. There's several insecticides allowed in the U.S. that are outlawed in some foreign countries, especially in Europe. Um, and yeah, it's a direct cause potentially of some of the cases of Parkinson's out there. It's hard to say who has that particularly, but it depends on what you've been exposed to. A lot of times, I mean, I've as a therapist, I've worked with people who grew up on farms or near farms. Who knows which pesticide it was, but they could have easily, and they have Parkinson's, and they could have easily been exposed to any of those. Some DDT is also one that could be linked to Parkinson's. Um, and um, and in addition to that, I've lost my train of thought. It was going to be about rotenone. So rotenone is not used very commonly any longer. R4D, that's another pesticide, by the way, or maybe it's a weed killer. Anyway, rotenone used to be used for fish kills, um, and especially like South America, Central America. And rotenone, I think, has been used in the U.S. as well, but that's been linked to Parkinson's as well. It's no longer used regularly, but it is still being used out there. So that's just a few examples. But yeah, they make genetic modifications to your cells if ingested over time or exposed to it over time. And by the way, we haven't talked about this, but there's gut brain connections with Parkinson's, and that's why diet is important as well as the neurological and cellular parts of it throughout the whole body. But there's some theory of Parkinson's being linked with gut problems from the beginning. That could be because of dietary issues or things you're consuming, but also the olfactory system, how we smell. The cribriform plate, which is where the olfactory nerve it enters the nose at the top. There's a mucous membrane there and skin, but just on the other side of that, there's little porous bone called the cribriform plate, and there's literally nerve endings right there, just under the surface, that lead to the olfactory nerve, which helps us give our sense of smell. That's a direct pathway into our neurological system. And so if you're smelling chemicals, if you're exposed to particulate of chemicals in the air as mist or whatnot, it could literally be going right into your mucous membrane and into your neural tissue.
Wow.
So it's and then there's no way to pinpoint which came, or like necessarily like, oh, this case of Parkinson's, every one of them came from smelling things, or every one of them came from gut. It's all linked.
There's
Yeah.
too many components in the
Yeah.
environment to link it that specifically, nor do you really need to, because
No. Yeah.
nor do you really need to, but we get we get that we're in this modern environment and that I mean, you sit in traffic, you're accumulating toxins. You know, we are accumulating toxins pretty much constantly throughout the day. It's just when they accumulate to a certain level across enough of a spectrum that we start to get serious diseases and stuff, right? It takes time.
Right.
It takes time to accumulate enough toxins in the body to produce a serious disease, right? Like we're not really seeing 10-year-olds diagnosed with Parkinson's, right? We're not really seeing
Well,
teenagers, well,
very rarely.
very, very rarely, but it depends on what genetic hand you've been dealt.
Hmm.
But we are seeing, but at some point in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, the vast majority of people are running into serious health problems at some point.
For sure.
And when you can spend all day and night, and another function of low dopamine is you're going to get into analysis paralysis from all of this
Yeah,
data, and it's like the why, the why, the why, the why, when eventually we need to focus on the how, the how of how to fix it, right? and
exactly.
and that takes us into this Mediterranean diet, which is probably the most recommended diet for people on Parkinson's disease. And
Yep.
hopefully we can show you guys why that's a poor recommendation.
Right. Well, right off the bat, you've got emphasis on fruits, more vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, olive oil, and fish, moderate consumption of dairy and wine. So, right off the top of the list, you've got multiple things that can cause inflammation, right?
Yeah.
Fruits can be carbohydrate heavy, depending on how what fruits and what quality they are. You got the grains and legumes and nuts can be carbohydrate driven. Not the nuts so much, but the whole grains and legumes for sure. Um, Olive oil and fish are okay, generally, but um, dairy and wine. I mean, you got alcohol, which is a sugar, um, which I mean, again, maybe in moderation for sure, but I mean, to
let, let,
do
let me just tell, if you guys are listening to this out there, let me just tell you something.
dairy is
It,
sugar.
if the Mediterranean diet is your strategy to fix your body, you're going to get nowhere fast.
Yeah.
You're going to get nowhere fast because number one, the quality of the fruits and the vegetable, it's like
Yep. Again,
it'd be very hard to even find. First, you got to find the best quality. Good luck finding a high quality whole grain in North America today.
yeah, yeah. Again, it's the quality of the food as well, and we do it differently here than it's done in Europe.
Yeah. And yeah, they're going to tell you about the benefits of it, but they're missing the key component that even if you started eating like that today, it's not the right inputs to change what's accumulated in your body. So, well, we'll get into that later, but you're there's probably a case to be made for somebody who has gone through a couple of years of nutritional recovery through things like the elimination diets and stuff, that one day they could return to a Mediterranean diet once they've achieved homeostasis back into their body. But that's going to take years to do, right? You're not, it takes years to fix what took decades to accumulate.
Right. Somebody had asked me specifically about mind diet before we did this webinar, and I can't see that it would be more helpful because it combines the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet, which I don't know what the acronym DASH stands for. I can't seem to find that. But essentially, um, you've got a combination of those diets. And again, you've got emphasis on things like berries, leafy greens, nuts, whole grains, and fish. Um, so, yeah, I mean, there are some potential anti-inflammatory benefits there. Certain berries, you've got lycopene, which can help reduction of inflammation. But again, you just have to you have to weigh your cost benefit analysis there, um, because
Just
I don't see how this would supposedly has strong evidence for reducing Alzheimer's risk and potential benefits for Parkinson's, but there's other ways I think that are better.
there's kind of two questions you want to ask yourself before you're going to make a dietary change. So you want to ask yourself, what changes am I looking to make? What changes do I want in my body?
Yep.
And how long do I have to stay on this diet to achieve those changes? So those two questions, if you wrote those questions down, so if you said to yourself, okay, I have insulin resistance and I have chronic inflammation, and those are my two fundamental health problems in my system right now. Then you could go through a whole variety of diets and you could ask yourself, is a Mediterranean diet going to change my insulin resistance meaningfully? And how
Right.
long would I have to stay on that diet to change it? And it's, the people who are recommending the Mediterranean diet to you, if you ask them those questions, they would have a hard time giving you a conclusive answer
Yeah.
because you're not actually affecting the system at a root cause or fundamentally enough to affect cause. So what they're actually doing is they're just repackaging up another sugar diet and giving it to you and hoping that you feel better about it.
Essentially, yeah. I mean, it I think some of these diets are attractive. We talk about this more later, but I feel like part of the reason they're attractive is because of the fact that they allow so many foods people are kind of addicted to or craving. Um, Anything basically with the sugar in it, essentially. Um, and I wanted to see, make sure I didn't have a statistic on this, but I don't know if I do. Um, anyway, we talked about insulin resistance, and we're gonna keep mentioning that in terms of Parkinson's. I'm going to try to breeze through these real quick. The low carbohydrate approach is there's multiple versions of that. Atkins is one of the more restrictive forms, but there's also protein power, which is essentially just low carbohydrate, high protein, and high fat. Um, and there's even other ones. So essentially, reducing carbohydrate intake, emphasizing fats and proteins. Uh, and it can be less restrictive than keto, for example. Um, Carbohydrate intake does have benefits. I mean, you're going to reduce your chances of having insulin resistance or reduce it if you have it already, and lower oxidative stress because of the reduction in sugar. But um, again, there's multiple ways you can approach things, and we're going to talk about that more. But this is just yet another way, and there's a lot of fads with low carb too. Um,
Low
a lot
carb,
of different.
like I kind of view when I hear low carb diet, I just view that personally as a complete nutrition psyop because it's like
It's one way to
if
think
you
about it.
if you've had carbohydrate if you have insulin resistance from carbohydrates that's built up over time,
Hmm.
your best strategy wouldn't be to go low carb, it would be to go no carb, right?
Right, exactly.
So because basically any amount of carbohydrates is going to take you out of ketosis. So
Right.
I find people who do the low carb diet, their first principle approach is, okay, the thing that they're focusing on day to day is just keeping their carbs as low as possible, but they're not paying attention to their protein and fat intakes. And
Not really.
if you're not getting enough fats, then you're going to have a hell of a time staying on a low carbohydrate diet because the only way you can adjust your satiety over the long run is to increase your fat. And you also have to reset your satiety hormones so that
Hmm.
you're not constantly yearning for more carbohydrates. It's
Yeah.
kind of like imagine a cocaine addict. Would the strategy be to put them on a low cocaine diet?
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
really no different in the nervous system at the end of the day. If you're
Right.
giving your
Exactly.
system any amount of that sugar, what it's going to do, your satiety hormones are just going to cry out for more and more sugar because it's recognizing that it's not getting as much as it did the
Yep.
day before. So the low carbohydrate diet is, in my experience with people, anybody who's doing low carbohydrates, eventually they're going to have a major fall off. And what happens is when your brain is fatigued, if you have a bad night's sleep, your ability to withstand the carbohydrates is going to drop off. And then you're going to have a sugar
Yep.
binge, and you're actually going to be exacerbating the problems that you were trying to fix in the first place.
Yeah, we talked about that earlier when we mentioned the ghrelin, the hormone, because yeah, you're gonna want to feed that that hunger, and then carbohydrates create more hunger. So it is a self-fulfilling prophecy if you start to
Yeah.
add carbohydrates back in. I agree with that. It's basically like the old calorie counting days. It's similar to that. Like when you have low carb, you're basically just counting carbs, not focusing on increasing the fat and proteins
Yeah.
so much. And in brief, the Walls Protocol is similar to Mediterranean. It emphasizes nutrient dense whole foods, especially vegetables, organ meats. That's interesting. So I guess that'd be liver and all so forth. And healthy fats while avoiding processed foods, gluten, and dairy. Specifically designed for mitochondrial health, providing nutrients required for optimal mitochondrial function, including, I mean, I feel like you could say that about any of the ones we talked about already.
Yeah. Again,
It's kind of repetitive.
and they're just repackaging the same old mantra, the same old carbohydrate dogma. And you can tell that they're doing that because when they say that, when they say they're giving you optimal nutrients for mitochondrial health,
Yeah,
well, optimal compared to what? Because if you take the nutrient profile of beef, oysters, different things like that, and you compare it to broccoli, kale, which is super. I see a lot of people with Parkinson's eating a lot of kale. I see different Parkinson's influencers showing their
well,
meals, and I frequently see kale. And you're just
I can't stand kale.
I know I can't stand that. The nutritional difference between beef and kale would be like the monetary difference between gold and paper.
Right. Yeah, that's a good analogy. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean,
So
yeah. So I do, and I think Dr. Walls certainly had success with her MS management with doing that kind of approach. But in the long and the short of it is she sold a book. So not to be
yeah.
too cynical, but I mean,
But but again, if you just get into the truth about it, it's like if they're recommending that you eat fruits and vegetables, they've been telling us to eat fruits and vegetables
right,
forever, forever.
right.
My whole life they've been telling us fruits.
Yep.
And it I like it was a huge mental shift that had to happen for me to make the commitment to, like, I remember when I made paleo diet was easy for me to go into because I'm like, oh, okay, I'm gonna eat a lot of chicken and a lot of broccoli. And at the time when I was doing that around 2010 to 2015, that was like that was like the gold standard for health in,
Yeah.
and that was the gold standard in health within our most healthy um, cultures in the environment. So I was in a CrossFit yoga culture. So I
Yep.
was around a lot of healthy people. Paleo diet was super popular. Everybody adopted it. It's a whole nother strategy to go. And even they're doing so. If you notice the link here between the Walls diet, the MAID diet, the keto diet, they're not really, there's no
Mind diet, you mean?
yeah, there's no elimination factor, right? And
No, yeah, there's not not much.
if you've accumulated decades of metabolic toxic poisoning over time, like we all have, like every elementary student in North America is doing today, then we don't see this here. You have to get comfortable with with the fact that you need to go through an elimination
Right.
phase. And that takes us a little bit into the intermittent fasting.
A little bit. Yeah, and this is the approach that you will hear most about commonly about as far as if you think of this term out in the public eye. It's basically where you have fasting periods and eating periods on a 24-hour scale. So, in other words, this is one example, 16/8, 16 hours fast, and then within an 8-hour period of the day, you're eating the meals you're having, and then you're not consuming anything outside of those 8 hours, or alternative day fasting, which really isn't fasting at all. But we'll talk about that more. But basically, um, now don't get us wrong. I mean, fasting is great, and we're going to talk about that too. But different approaces to fasting. Mitochondrial support in the sense that it helps with cellular autophagy, and of course mitophagy, because your mitochondria can regenerate, or basically damaged mitochondria can be eaten up and repackaged and you have mitochondrial neogenesis, but then autophagy of the entire cell, where you're taking damaged parts, misfolded proteins, eating them up and repackaging them and generating things anew. And so, um, anyway, that's this form of fasting. Though we're going to talk about this more, but this form of fasting, as it is written here, is not nearly as effective as it needs to be to truly get into cellular autophagy.
The problem that they're running into is it takes about 24 hours for
Yeah,
your liver to clear the carbohydrates, right? So you've got it takes 24 hours to even burn them all off. Otherwise, you're still storing them. One of the components that I talk about with my people is I call it carb stacking. And what intermittent fasting is doing is they're basically just trying not to stack as much carbohydrates. They're trying to give your body a period of time within 24 hours to burn off the carbohydrates. But then again, it's popular because it's easy, but does it work? It works to some degree, but it does not go far enough because it doesn't allow you to get into meaningful autophagy to actually start to clean your cells out. Because if you're, for example, if you're eating any sugar or carbohydrates in that 8 hour period, and then you go into your 16-hour fast, well, you actually haven't burned all of those carbohydrates out of the system in that 16 hours. It actually takes about 24 hours to burn off. And following 24 hours, you're going to start dipping your toes into ketosis. But again, you're not going to be into a lot of ketosis. It's a spectrum, and it's going to take 3 or 4 or 5 days to even get into an elevated amount of ketones in your blood. So the intermittent fasting, just like the previous diets we went over, yeah, they can have some benefit, but they're not going to have enough benefit to make meaningful changes in a lot of people who are suffering from accumulated disease in their body.
do you know why John would be trying to request remote access of my computer right now?
I do not know.
And now it says you're trying to do it, but I think it's because he changed the name to Lars Konga. I mean, I don't know
I
what's going on.
I don't know why.
I know Steve had posted a link to the Zoom call in our WhatsApp chat, and I don't know if anyway, I don't know what he's trying to do, but I'm not gonna let him get remote access to my computer. um, sorry, John. Okay, caloric restriction.
Maybe maybe he's trying to get onto the webinar. I don't know.
Maybe, but I'm not sure what's going on. We'll give him a replay. Caloric restriction. Basically, this is just reducing your overall caloric intake without the risk of malnutrition. Um, and reducing caloric intake, of course, um, it's not exactly the same as fasting, but it's kind of like a pre-fast, I guess. You've been practicing caloric intake along with some other techniques recently, haven't you?
Yeah, so caloric restriction again. Caloric restriction is it's your best bet just for body fat. It's not going to do much to clean up your cells. It's going to reduce your energy, and you can play around with it. But I would say for people with Parkinson's disease, the caloric restriction angle is it's not a strategy that you need to focus on. It's a strategy that can come up later on that you can use for different components for body composition, and you can do that effectively. But again, not all calories are equal. So are they fat calories, protein calories, or carbohydrate calories? Because if you start to play,
Yeah,
for example, the caloric restriction can be a good idea if you're doing a high fat diet during an elimination zone. And if you want to restrict your calories over a period of time, you can really effectively change your body composition. But I would say, like for the caloric restriction, it's not going to be a good strategy for people with Parkinson's disease. What you actually, I can get
I
into
agree
that
with that actually.
I can get into that more later, but I don't recommend and it's like the thing to know about the caloric restriction is which time horizon are we going to be performing the caloric restriction on? Because I mean, if you did a 7-day caloric restriction, that can have a benefit for your body fat composition. But then if you were doing like a 30-day caloric restriction, that's going to be a completely different physiological goal that you'd be trying to hit. Predominantly, people who are doing caloric restriction are actually practicing that just for aesthetic gains. And if you took a 30-day time horizon for people who are on, for people who have Parkinson's disease, we need to achieve two things. We need to achieve an elimination zone so we can get into autophagy and so we can start to clean the cells and open up the mitochondria.
Mm-hmm.
But on that 30-day horizon, we also need to be fueling the body highly effectively so we can start to reorganize the brain's components into ketosis. And then we're not looking for caloric restriction. In fact, in some periods, we're looking for an overfeed. And those overfeed periods are kind of crucial because if you took let's say you took a 4-day fast, how are you going to refeed yourself after a 4-day fast? Because a 4-day fast is it's going to do a whole lot for your inflammation. You're going to feel it. You're going to feel a low energy zone for a couple of days in that fast. But when you come out of the fast, you need to fuel the body at a high caloric rate now. Which type of calories are you going to use? Typically I'm liking like a high fat, good protein amount for 4 or 5 or 6 days after. And you're going to
Mm-hmm.
feel your brain. You can actually literally feel it. I do this all the time. And I fast for 4 or 5 days and I eat either beef suet or beef fingers or tallow. So I'm eating like basically pure beef fat. And you can actually feel it tracking right up the back of your neck into the base of your skull. It's got this, it's like, it's a super interesting feeling. It almost feels like water is flowing up your neck into the brain. And it's not easily done, but once people can start feeling that, they're like 6 or 8 months into their healing journey at that point, and their brain is getting re-energized from that beef fat. But again, they're not in a caloric restriction on a time horizon. Yeah, they were in a caloric restriction for 4 or 5 days while they fasted, but then we're smacking the body with a whole bunch of super bioavailable calories in the form of beef fat, and the brain is just sucking it up and saying thank you.
Right.
It's a good one. Even
Yeah.
even the carnivore. So the carnivore diet, I've been into the carnivore diet for 5 years. And the thing to remember, and the thing that none of these diets are going to talk about, is time horizon. Because
Right.
it's like, do you want to do the carnivore diet? And for most people, there's going to be pros and cons to the carnivore diet too, because for the people who are on the carbidopa levodopas, the
Yes.
carnivore diet is going to reduce the efficacy, it's going to reduce
Yeah.
the effectiveness of the dopaminergic agents. So they're going to
Mm-hmm.
have to, and there can be a lot of little dialing. I call it the dialing process, so that you're both getting enough protein. But really, with the carnivore diet, again, it needs to be a high fat carnivore diet.
Right. That's where some of the other diets we talk about lean meats, but if you have lean meats, you're not getting the fat content. So the fat content is okay. I mean, there's no reason to demonize fat. It's not gonna,
Ketosis is fat. You're
right.
burning your ketosis is you're burning fat. Again, we're born in ketosis.
John
One of
finally
one,
here.
one of the best effects that you can do for your Parkinson's disease management. One of the most crucial. There's two super crucial components. If you just kind of forget about all of the dietary, from carnivore to the Mediterranean diet to the paleo diet, you just want to start breaking those apart between carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And then you want to talk about, within that, you want to talk about elimination zones, fasting zones, and you want to talk about refeed zones. And
Yep.
then the last component that I like to really mention to people is we have basically strategic, we have routine eating windows, and that could be carnivore, it could be keto, could be whatever you choose. And then we have the occasional windows, because I am still yet to meet a client who doesn't want to eat birthday cake at their child's birthday. So
Sure.
it's like we talk about diets as this full, and oh, I'm on the carnivore diet. Nobody in the year 2025, almost nobody on the earth has been in on the carnivore diet for their entire lives. We have to go back to the 1830s to find those people. And when we go back to the 1830s and study those people, what we learn is they never had any of these diseases in their cultures. So, key component I want to mention to you guys is we've got it's the feast and the famine diet. And you want to go through famines. That's the elimination cycles, where you're
Mhm.
eliminating the chronic inflammation from your system. And then we have the feasting zones. And in those feasting zones, we want to have high fat, good, clean protein. And we want it to be super nutrient dense, and we want it to be super bioavailable, meaning that you can actually use the nutrients you're eating. Because again, when you start to compare vegetables and beef, you're going to see that the nutrients you're getting from the vegetables, your body can't even absorb them at the same levels that they can absorb the nutrients that you're getting from beef, right? So it's kind of wasted eating. And again, for people who have constipation issues, you're kind of
Yeah.
exacerbating your constipation issues with trying to get your nutrients from vegetables. So pay attention to your routine eating. Those are the times when you're going to work and you got a 7 day window, and it's like, how can I eat? What can I do strategically to benefit my body the most in a 7 day period? And then that's going to take you into autophagy, and that's going to take you into carnivore diet, potentially paleo diet, depending. But then you need to allow yourself the occasional periods. And if you do the routine periods well, if you do the feast and the famine periods very effectively and well, what you're going to learn is that you can guilt free go through the occasional chocolate cake periods, and you're not going to be stacking inflammation into your body. So, time horizon is one of the most important things to develop in your nutritional strategy for Parkinson's disease. Gluten free. Gluten,
Yeah, so I
gluten.
wanted to mention this briefly before we get the last slide or two, which is, and we should wrap up soon. But gluten free, essentially, gluten has impact as well on inflammation and gut health. And so, reduction or eliminating gluten from your diet can also really potentially help with reduction of Parkinson's symptoms and progression. And that gut brain axis is part of that connection. So, just something else. It's not, I mean, again, you don't need to necessarily eradicate gluten 100% from your diet to have a difference. And we're going to talk more about that. And Lars has already alluded to all this, basically, about not, who wants to not have birthday cake at your kid's birthday, right? You
Yeah.
can't. Yeah, it's not. Even the recommendations we're going to talk about are not dogmatic in certain ways, in that sense. I don't know why John just asked me to boot him out of the meeting so he could rejoin. I'm really confused. But anyway, um, we're going to talk about what we already talked about this. These various diets we discussed have limitations in their pure forms. And I think the way I would word it is the key is combining these principles that are found in some of these things to aim for the highest ketosis levels and promoting cellular autophagy. That's what is going to promote healing and prevent neurodegeneration.
That's probably my favorite bullet point of this whole presentation. And
We
I'm
saved
going to
it for
tell,
last.
I want to tell you why. Because first of all, it's actually difficult to get into ketosis. And if you want to get into ketosis simply, you need to fast for either 24 or 48 hours from carbohydrates,
Yeah,
meaning that you would have to only eat protein and fat for 24 hours.
yeah,
And then following that, if you did a 24-hour fast, you're going to elevate your ketosis levels because there's no more fat coming into the system. So it's going to spike up higher. But then how ketosis works is it works on a cycle. So you can buy ketosis strips from online, from Amazon, or from any
Hmm.
store, any pharmacy store. And it's a really good idea to measure your ketosis for 7-day periods of routine hyper-strategic eating. And once you figure out how to get yourself into ketosis, and once you start doing that on a time horizon, we've got
Hmm.
52 weeks in a year. So let's say that we were going to attempt to be in ketosis for 45 out of 52 of those weeks. And if you are successful in that, your body is going to have to go into something called gluconeogenesis. And that's the ability
Yep.
for your body to turn fat and protein back into sugar again.
Hmm.
And that's a really interesting concept. And it got lost in the early days of the carnivore diet. But what happens is, as you go in and out of those cycles, as you cycle in and out of ketosis, your body becomes stronger at that conversion. It becomes more efficient at it. And as it becomes more efficient at that conversion, guess what problem you're not going to have anymore? Insulin resistance.
Yeah.
You have solved a root cause issue of your disease in a year. And it takes about a year to get your body in really good shape. And for me, when I measure my ketosis, I can get my body into the highest levels of ketosis through autophagy and exercise in about 2 days now, where it
Hmm.
used to take me 7 days, 8 days. And you
But
have to learn to cycle in and out of that. And then again, when you're out of it, if you're going into a carbohydrate period, if that child's, if the carbohydrates at your kid's birthday starts lasting into the next day and the next day and the next day, now you're losing your gluconeogenesis fitness.
I was going to say that think about also the cellular, you know, the damage that's been caused from previous toxins that you've had over your lifetime, the sugars you've eaten, the food dyes, all those things, and you mentioned going into it, and it takes only about a couple of days to get into ketosis for you now that you've done it for this long. But that's because I would argue that you've your cells have transformed from where they were before, so that
Yes.
you have you may have some introduction of something inflammatory like carbohydrates. You eat ice cream in the summer, you go to a kid's birthday party, whatever it might be, but then you get right back into those habits and you're right back into where you need to be.
Yeah, and
So
I even pay attention to, like, when I go back into the sad diet for a couple of days with the kids around, I kind of have this conscious meter in my mind, and I'm like, okay, now I need to rid my body of the inflammation that I have accumulated again, right?
yeah.
So again, it's like, if we everything we've just talked about, the main takeaway I would want people to understand is we were born on this planet in feast, and we quickly went into famine periods. And everybody on the planet would have experienced multiple days of autophagy just by the geographic reality of the interplay between animals and humans, right? You
Yeah.
can't always find animals day in, day out. It's not like a 7-Eleven, and it's not like a grocery store. So in that process, we evolved. We evolved along these feast and famine cycles, and we evolved very strongly. And something I learned is, whenever nature gives us struggle, a period of scarcity without abundance, it's also going to give us a little biological helper along that.
Hmm.
And you can notice this with autophagy. You can notice this with fermented meats. You can really easily notice this with exercise, right? If you
Yeah.
go through 15 minutes of exercise today doing burpees or squats, you're going to get a physiological benefit from that in the following days.
Right.
So nature is set up to put us through these feast and famine periods, right? When we go through a famine period, we accumulate benefits through that scarcity aspect, through that famine aspect. And what it allows us to do is it allows us to clean up all of the toxins that we have accumulated previously. That can be inflammation, that can be injury. And you're talking, so A little side note, I've mentioned this before, and it's a key component because I fought inflammation, pain in my L1 and L3
Right.
for 20 years. And I went through Atkins diet, paleo diet. I went through a whole slew of different exercises and a whole slew of different medical um, practices that they put on me, everything from cupping to massage to chiropractor, you
Hmm.
name it. But what I learned is that as you get rid of the layers of inflammation in your cells through famine periods, you can actually take that right down into the core where I felt that pain in my L1 and I felt it acutely for years and then less acutely. And what I noticed was once I had accumulated enough days in autophagy to take out all of that inflammation, I kind of got to the point where I had forgotten about the pain that used to exist in my spine. So we can get rid of 99% of the inflammation in our body. And we can do that on a 4-year time horizon, and anybody can do it. What you choose to eat should be strategic and sometimes occasional. When you're eating strategic, you're going to want to prioritize fat, then protein, and you're going to leave the carbohydrates for the occasional periods of your diet when you're eating with family or you're eating for Christmas and you don't want to make a big scene. So that's how
Right.
you, so really what we should be talking about when it comes to nutrition is time horizon thinking, right? You want to break that
Yep.
apart between routine and occasional, and you want to further break that apart between feast and famine. We want to, once we start to practice and utilize those nutritional components, those dials, what we're going to find is that we have a long runway of healing that never has to stop.
Right. And the time horizon is something that goes into the future. It's not as, it's a time horizon. It's always on the horizon. It's not a stop sign,
It's
right?
not a stop sign. We are
Not a
moving.
destination, basically.
No, and that's in accordance with our dopamine, right? We dopamine is the idea molecule. It's a more molecule. We get added dopamine when we're moving towards something. As soon as we get it, we don't get that same dopamine spike from it, which
Yep.
actually is an interesting segue and probably will take us into our next podcast, which is probably going to be on nutrition and dopamine and the interplay between uh, dopamine, circadian, exercise, and nutrition, and how to hack those four things.
Yep.
Because the more and more work that I do with people with Parkinson's, like people who all my Parkinson's people who go through periods of autophagy, they start off in fear of it. Oh my God, I can't fast for 1 or 2 days. And then it's on the horizon, right? And then once they've achieved it, they get a dopamine reward from having achieved it.
Yep.
And then they're back into their routine periods of eating, or maybe their occasional periods of eating. No more dopamine reward from that. But then we look forward to another famine period and we get another dopamine spike from that. So you can actually, it's not a theory that's proven out yet, and I don't have enough practice behind it to prove it, but I can see it happening and I can see it working. And it's the future of Parkinson's disease, in my opinion.
I definitely think it's a approach that needs to be done. Um, oops, sorry. The Steve actually said something about 10 days. I think he's into a 10-day fast right now,
Yeah,
which is
he's on a
in
10-day right now.
incredible.
Yeah, it
Um,
is.
and do we still have, oh yeah,
So
Patricia's back on.
Steve started off with a 48 hour, and he's about I think he's probably 8, maybe coming up on 9 months in with me here. And again, he started off with full Parkinson's, tremors, depression, nightly. He's getting up 8, 9, 10 times a night. And as we continue to go through these feast and famine cycles with him, he just slowly and consistently gets better and better and better and better. And I think for a lot of people, the idea of not eating for 10 days might sound really, really severe. And how I would respond to that is um, 5 pounds of body fat on our stomachs, in our arms, on our legs, in our face. That's about 15,000 calories. And our body can comfortably live off of that for many, many days at a time. So if we can get rid of the fear of fasting and we can start biting off small fasting chunks, what we're going to find is a land of healing on the other side of it. And Steve is an absolute testament to that. I'm looking forward to doing a podcast with him in a little over a week's time as he graduates into a new level of health post fast. So he's doing really well, and I look forward to unpacking that with him, because there's nothing else on the planet that's going to change your symptoms as thoroughly and as effectively and as consistently as feast, famine, autophagy, ketosis, exercise, and circadian. And if you go through all of those components that I just talked about, there's a lowest common denominator in them. There's nothing to be sold. There's no supplement, there's no medication, it's not a procedure. It's a lifestyle of realignment. And it works on a time horizon. And if you do that time horizon effectively and efficiently, you are reducing your cellular inflammation. Yep. And when you reduce the cellular inflammation, everything starts to come back, your mitochondrial function, everything. And I think I'll probably leave it. I'll stop talking after this point. It doesn't have to end. It can go on like this. You can still enjoy birthday cakes, and you can still start to enjoy deeper and deeper and deeper levels of your God-given health that he gave to you at some point that we have lost along this carbohydrate accumulation journey, right?
Right. Yeah, and I'm not sure why. Do you see this whiteboard popping up?
Yeah, I think John has hacked the system here. He's going into the
I don't know. Oh gosh. I'll tell you what I'm going to do real quick. For those of you watching on YouTube, I think we're going to conclude that part of it, but I'm going to keep this going for our participants that are joining the Zoom meeting, so that we can do a little Q&A if anybody wants to stick around for another 10 minutes or so. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the live stream.